deep beneath the burning sands, where scorching winds have buried the ambitions of pharaohs, a grandfather's face emerges unchanged after 3,000 years. His skin, leathered but intact, bears the serene expression of one who believed death was merely the beginning of an infinitely grander existence. Around him lie golden amulets, intricate scrolls covered in hieroglyphs, and jars containing organs preserved with chemical precision that rivals modern science. This is Egypt's ultimate obsession, the systematic conquest of death itself. For over 3 millennia, an entire civilization devoted its greatest minds, vast resources, and architectural genius to a single audacious goal: ensuring that consciousness would survive bodily destruction. They built monuments that pierced the heavens, developed preservation techniques that defeated decay, and created the most elaborate map of the afterlife humanity has ever conceived. When the elder died during the drought of 3400 BC, his family faced a decision that would echo through millennia. Their traditional burial ground along the Nile had flooded during the previous year's exceptional inundation, forcing them to carry his body higher into the desert than any of their ancestors had ever been laid to rest. As they scraped a hollow from the burning sand, positioning him carefully to face the western horizon where the sun disappeared each evening, they performed the first recorded act in humanity's longest war against death itself. 3 seasons later, when shifting winds exposed the grave, his grandson made a discovery that changed everything. Instead of the bones and scraps of cloth he expected to find, the young man gazed upon his grandfather's face, peaceful and recognizable, as though he had closed his eyes only moments before. The desert's scorching heat and bone-dry air had drawn every drop of moisture from the flesh, creating preservation so perfect it seemed like magic. Death, apparently, need not mean the destruction of the person who had been. Word of this miracle spread along the river, reaching the workshops at Hierakonpolis, where artisans had been experimenting with ways to honor their most respected dead. If the desert could preserve a body through natural forces, perhaps human skill could enhance what nature had begun. Master craftsmen began wrapping bodies in fine linen before burial, stuffing the cavities with aromatic sawdust and natron salt, treating the skin with plant resins that slowed decay even further. Each innovation built upon the previous, as families competed to ensure their loved ones would emerge from the sand as perfectly preserved as that first miraculous discovery. But preservation of the body raised troubling questions that demanded answers. If flesh and bone could be maintained indefinitely, what happened to the invisible essence that had animated them in life? Priests at various settlements developed different explanations, yet all agreed that survival required more than simply preventing decay. Something else needed to be preserved, that vital force they began calling the Ka, which gave life meaning and personality its distinctive character. Young scribes learning to carve commemorative stones encountered this problem firsthand when commissioned to create memorial statues for the preserved dead. How could limestone capture something that had never been seen? Through trial and error, they discovered that certain approaches seemed to work better than others. Eyes had to be wide and alert, suggesting continuing awareness even in death. Mouths required slight openings, ready to speak or receive offerings from the living. Hands needed positioning that could accept gifts, maintaining the reciprocal relationships that bound families together across generations. These K statues, as they came to be known, provided physical anchors for invisible spirits that otherwise might drift away into nothingness. Families built special chambers adjacent to burial sites where the statues could receive daily offerings of food and drink, ensuring that their departed relatives remained connected to the world of the living rather than disappearing entirely into whatever realm awaited beyond death. Master stone carvers, carrying these techniques from settlement to settlement, gradually spread innovations that had originated in isolated workshops throughout the valley. At Memphis, where the great river divided into multiple channels before reaching the sea, sculptors developed methods for creating statues that seemed almost alive. Further south, at the Great Bend, where fertile floodplains supported increasingly wealthy communities, artisans pioneered techniques for incorporating precious materials that enhanced the statue's magical effectiveness. Yet it was at the dramatic gap in the western cliffs, where the dying sun seemed to pass directly through rock formations into the hidden realm beyond, that these scattered innovations achieved their most powerful synthesis. Local priests claimed this natural gateway was where Osiris, the first being ever to die and be reborn, had entered the underworld to become its eternal ruler. Pilgrims traveled from throughout the valley to bury their dead at this sacred spot, where proximity to the divine precedent might ensure similar resurrections for their own family members. The mythology surrounding Osiris provided explanations for mysteries that had puzzled every family dealing with death and preservation. According to the stories developing around this sacred site, Osiris had once been a living king whose wise and just rule brought prosperity to all his subjects. His jealous brother Seth, however, could not bear watching someone else receive such universal love and respect. Through treachery and violence, Seth murdered his brother, then dismembered the body and scattered its pieces across the known world to prevent any possibility of restoration. But Osiris possessed something Seth had failed to consider: a devoted wife whose love exceeded even death's ability to destroy. Isis searched the entire earth until she had recovered every fragment of her husband's corpse, then used magical knowledge passed down from the gods themselves to reassemble what had been destroyed. Through her power, Osiris achieved new life, though not the earthly existence he had known before. Instead, he became ruler of the realm of the dead, offering hope for similar transformation to any mortal who followed proper burial procedures and moral conduct. This divine precedent transformed death from an ending into a transition, requiring careful preparation and powerful assistance. Families throughout the valley began incorporating elements from the Osiris mythology into their own burial practices, adapting the gods' resurrection techniques to their particular circumstances and resources. If Isis could reassemble divine fragments through magical knowledge, perhaps human survivors could ensure their loved ones' successful transformation through proper rituals and tomb provisions. Regional variations reflected local conditions, while contributing to increasingly sophisticated understanding of what post-mortem survival might require. In the Delta, where annual flooding created rich agricultural lands that supported large populations, burial traditions emphasized agricultural metaphors, bodies positioned like seeds planted in fertile soil, surrounded by model granaries and farming tools that would enable continued productivity in whatever fields awaited beyond death. Desert communities developed different approaches that emphasized preservation and endurance, providing their dead with equipment for surviving harsh conditions rather than tools for cultivation. Gnome gods governing these different regions offered specialized assistance that reflected their own domains and expertise. Sobek, the crocodile deity of the Fayum marshlands, provided protection during the dangerous water crossings that souls would face in the afterlife. Horus, the hawk god soaring above southern territories, offered keen sight for navigating paths through the underworld's treacherous landscapes. Khnum, the ram-headed potter of the First Cataract, possessed skills for reshaping souls into forms capable of eternal existence. Yet beneath these regional differences, common themes emerged that suggested underlying truths about death and survival that transcended local variations. All agreed that the deceased retained some form of personal identity that could recognize family members and respond to their needs. All accepted that proper preparation during earthly life significantly influenced post-mortem conditions. Most importantly, all acknowledged that survival after death was not automatic, but required active intervention by both the living and various divine powers. Royal courts adopting these beliefs faced unique challenges that demanded unprecedented innovations. Rulers who claimed divine authority during their earthly reigns needed afterlife accommodations that reflected their special status, while providing precedents for their successors to follow. Simple preservation and basic K statues, adequate for ordinary mortals, could not sufficiently honor kings whose deaths threatened the cosmic order that kept the world functioning properly. During the reign of Nama, whose military campaigns unified the valley under single authority around 3100 BC, royal burial practices achieved new levels of sophistication that would influence traditions for millennia. Instead of simple mastaba tombs built from mud brick, the king's eternal residence was constructed from limestone blocks quarried from cliffs along the river and transported to the burial site through engineering projects that required thousands of workers laboring for multiple seasons. Stone architecture created possibilities that earlier materials could never have provided. Limestone could support massive weights, enabling construction of burial chambers large enough to accommodate all the equipment that royal afterlife would require. Carved reliefs covering the walls provided permanent records of magical formulas necessary for successful resurrection, eliminating dependence on oral traditions that might be forgotten or corrupted over time. Most importantly, stone could endure indefinitely, providing eternal homes for spirits that would likewise exist forever. Master scribes working on these royal projects faced the challenge of transforming oral traditions into written texts that would preserve essential magical knowledge with perfect accuracy. Every word had to be carved correctly, every symbol positioned appropriately, every formula activated through proper ritual procedures to provide intended benefits. These early religious inscriptions were not literature, but practical manuals containing specific instructions that had proved effective in ensuring post-mortem survival. Economic resources that unified states could mobilize enabled elaboration of burial provisions far beyond what individual families could afford. Professional craftsmen devoted entire careers to producing sophisticated equipment for royal burials, while organized labor forces constructed tomb complexes requiring coordination between quarries, workshops, transport crews, and construction teams spread across hundreds of kilometers. Concentration of wealth and authority in royal courts created possibilities for architectural and artistic achievement that would define this civilization's burial traditions throughout their subsequent development. Temple complexes associated with royal burial sites incorporated facilities specifically designed for maintaining offerings to deceased rulers indefinitely. Professional priests were appointed to perform daily rituals that would sustain royal spirits throughout eternity, while endowments of agricultural land provided economic foundations for such perpetual service. These innovations established precedents for massive mortuary institutions that would characterize later periods, while demonstrating state commitment to ensuring royal post-mortem welfare that exceeded anything attempted for ordinary mortals. Sacred sites throughout the unified kingdom developed specialized functions within increasingly complex religious landscapes. The great burial ground beside the Sacred Gap remained the most prestigious destination, but Memphis emerged as the center for royal burial traditions, while Heliopolis became the focus for solar theology that would later dominate official afterlife beliefs. Competition and cooperation between these centers drove innovation as priests and architects sought to attract royal patronage through demonstrating superior techniques for ensuring successful post-mortem transitions. Yet even as royal burial practices achieved unprecedented sophistication, fundamental questions remained unanswered. Preservation techniques could maintain bodies indefinitely. Magical formulas could provide protection during dangerous afterlife journeys, and elaborate tomb equipment could supply whatever needs might arise in the realm of the dead. But what determined who would successfully complete the transition and who might fail? Were proper preparations sufficient to guarantee favorable outcomes, or did personal conduct during earthly life influence post-mortem conditions? Royal inscriptions from this period began incorporating claims about divine approval for particular rulers' earthly actions, suggesting that moral behavior was becoming a factor in afterlife evaluations. The realm of the dead was not merely a destination that anyone could reach through adequate preparation. It was becoming a place where conduct would be judged, and where inappropriate behavior during earthly life could result in post-mortem punishment rather than eternal reward. These concepts remained rudimentary compared to later developments, but they established principles that would become central to this civilization's understanding of death and survival. By the end of this formative period, beliefs that had emerged from simple desert preservation had evolved into sophisticated systems requiring careful preparation, powerful magic, divine assistance, and moral conduct. Death had been transformed from termination into transition, offering eternal life in perfected form for those who met increasingly complex requirements. Master craftsmen, perfecting preservation techniques in royal workshops, understood they were participating in humanity's greatest endeavor, the conquest of death itself, through knowledge, skill, and divine favor. Stone carvers, creating eternal residences for royal spirits, recognized that their architectural innovations would influence construction for centuries to come. Priests developing ritual procedures for maintaining post-mortem connections between the living and the dead were establishing practices that would define religious traditions throughout this civilization's remarkable duration. The foundation had been laid for achievements that would astonish the ancient world and inspire human imagination throughout subsequent history. Modest beliefs emerging from accidental desert preservation would evolve into the most elaborate vision of life beyond death that humanity would ever develop, while simple stone structures would grow into monuments that defied every limitation of ancient technology. The afterlife that had been imagined during these early centuries would become the driving force behind one of history's greatest civilizations, as an entire culture dedicated itself to the conviction that death was merely the beginning of existence in its most glorious form. When Djoser's architect, Imhotep, gazed across the Saqqara Plateau around 2670 BC, envisioning a tomb that would pierce the sky itself, he was responding to a theological crisis that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. The king's death could no longer be merely a transition requiring proper burial. It had become a cosmic event that demanded architectural innovation, matching the scale of divine transformation taking place within the royal corpse. If divine kings truly possessed the celestial essence that kept the universe functioning, their eternal residences needed to reflect capabilities that transcended anything attempted for mere mortals. The stepped pyramid that rose from Imhotep's revolutionary vision represented more than architectural achievement. It embodied a fundamental transformation in how royal death was understood and prepared for. Each level of the massive structure corresponded to stages of celestial ascent that the king's spirit would climb toward its ultimate destination among the circumpolar stars. unlike earlier royal tombs that had focused primarily on preserving the body and providing earthly comforts. This monument was designed as a resurrection machine that would transform the dead ruler into a stellar deity, capable of governing cosmic forces from his eternal throne in the northern sky. Master astronomers working with Imhotep's architectural teams made discoveries that would revolutionize religious thinking throughout the kingdom. By carefully tracking celestial movements throughout multiple seasons, they identified specific star groups that never disappeared below the horizon, the imperishable ones that circled the celestial pole in eternal motion. These stars, they realized, provided perfect destinations for royal spirits that required immortal existence rather than mere preservation. If pharaohs could join these stellar deities, they would participate in cosmic motion that guaranteed eternal life while maintaining divine authority over earthly affairs. Within the underground chambers of Djoser's pyramid, teams of master scribes faced the unprecedented challenge of creating written guides for navigating the celestial realm that royal spirits would encounter after death. Previous royal burials had relied on oral traditions and simple magical formulas carved on tomb walls, but the complexity of stellar transformation required comprehensive instruction manuals that could anticipate every challenge the deceased ruler might face during his cosmic journey. These texts needed to provide not just protection, but detailed directions for achieving successful integration into divine stellar hierarchies. The breakthrough came when High Priest Khaemweset discovered that certain magical formulas, when spoken in proper sequence while performing specific ritual actions, could apparently facilitate communication between the living and spirits that had already achieved stellar transformation. Testing these procedures in the Royal Mortuary Temple, priests found they could receive guidance from previously deceased rulers about requirements for successful post-mortem transitions. These revelations provided the theological foundation for developing comprehensive written guides that would become known as the Pyramid Texts. Yet even as these innovations emerged from collaborative efforts between architects, astronomers, and priests, practical problems continued to challenge every aspect of royal burial preparation. The massive stone blocks required for pyramid construction had to be quarried in upper regions, transported hundreds of kilometers down the Nile, then dragged across desert terrain to construction sites using techniques that pushed ancient engineering capabilities to their limits. Simultaneously, workshops throughout the kingdom struggled to produce burial equipment sophisticated enough to support royal transformation into stellar deities rather than merely preserved human spirits. Khufu's decision to construct the largest pyramid ever attempted reflected growing confidence that royal death could achieve unprecedented heights of divine authority. His architects, building upon innovations developed for previous royal monuments, designed passages and chambers that would channel cosmic forces directly into the heart of the structure where royal transformation would take place. The precision required for aligning these passages with specific stellar targets demanded mathematical calculations and construction techniques that represented the pinnacle of ancient technological achievement. Within the Great Pyramid's internal chambers, ritual specialists developed ceremonies that would become the template for royal resurrection procedures throughout the subsequent Old Kingdom period. The opening of the mouth ritual, performed on the royal mummy before sealing the burial chamber, involved symbolic actions that would restore the deceased king's ability to breathe, eat, speak, and see in his transformed stellar existence. The ceremony required specific tools, a Pasesh Kef knife made from meteoric iron that connected earthly implements to stellar destinations, an adze for opening the mouth, and a leg of beef that provided spiritual nourishment for the dangerous journey ahead. Each gesture had to be performed precisely according to written instructions, while priests recited magical formulas that would activate the ritual's transformative power. The most shocking theological innovation appearing in these early pyramid texts was the cannibal hymn, a spell that revealed the raw cosmic violence underlying royal resurrection. "The king eats men and lives on gods," the text proclaimed, describing how the deceased ruler would hunt, kill, and devour divine beings to absorb their magical powers. This wasn't metaphorical language, but literal description of processes that would enable royal spirits to accumulate the cosmic authority necessary for governing stellar realms. The king would eat their wisdom and swallow their spirits, transforming from a dead mortal into a cosmic predator capable of dominating even ancient deities. Such imagery shocked later periods that preferred more civilized approaches to divine transformation, but it revealed the primal theological thinking that justified royal claims to universal authority. But the most remarkable innovation emerging during Khufu's reign was the systematic mapping of celestial geography that would guide royal spirits through their post-mortem journeys. Court astronomers, working with mortuary priests, created detailed descriptions of stellar realms that identified specific destinations appropriate for different aspects of royal consciousness. The divine king's BA, that mobile component of personality that could travel between earthly and celestial realms, required different stellar accommodations than his K, which needed permanent residence among imperishable stars. Meanwhile, his AKH, the transformed state achieved through successful resurrection, would join solar deities in their daily journeys across the sky while maintaining nighttime residence in stellar palaces. The solar bark journey that would carry royal spirits through their eternal adventures required understanding of cosmic geography that extended far beyond simple star charts. Each day, the royal HKH would join Ra's crew aboard the magnificent vessel that carried the sun across the sky, from eastern horizon to western mountains. During daylight hours, this journey proceeded through familiar celestial territories where friendly deities ensured safe passage. But sunset marked the beginning of a far more dangerous passage through the underworld's 12 hours of night, where hostile serpents and demons sought to destroy the solar vessel and prevent the dawn's renewal. The Horus-Seth conflict that provided theological justification for royal resurrection revealed how divine kingship could survive even complete destruction through proper magical intervention. According to the mythological cycle, Horus had been conceived posthumously when Isis used her magical powers to revive Osiris's corpse just long enough for procreation. The son who resulted from this necromantic union possessed legitimate claims to his father's throne, despite Seth's usurpation, but he could only actualize these claims through combat that would demonstrate divine approval. The battles between uncle and nephew involved not just physical violence, but magical contests where victory required superior knowledge of cosmic forces. Royal resurrection followed similar patterns. Deceased kings needed to defeat hostile powers through magical combat before they could claim their stellar thrones. Master craftsmen producing burial equipment for these royal transformations faced unprecedented technical challenges that drove innovation throughout artistic and manufacturing traditions. Royal canopic jars, which would house the divine king's preserved internal organs, needed to incorporate stellar symbolism while providing magical protection during the dangerous transition period between death and resurrection. Jewelry and amulets required precious materials and sophisticated craftsmanship that would demonstrate royal worthiness for stellar transformation while providing practical magical assistance during post-mortem trials. Economic resources required for these royal burial preparations strained the kingdom's capabilities while generating technological innovations that benefited civilian populations throughout the realm. Quarrying techniques developed for pyramid construction improved stone availability for temple and administrative building projects. Transportation methods pioneered for moving massive stone blocks enhanced commercial shipping capabilities along the Nile. Metalworking skills refined in royal workshops for producing burial equipment improved agricultural tools and weapons available to farmers and soldiers. Yet the financial costs of maintaining royal stellar transformation created structural problems that threatened the kingdom's long-term stability. Each pyramid required decades of sustained effort from thousands of workers whose labor was diverted from agricultural and commercial activities that generated state revenues. Mortuary priesthoods, established to maintain eternal offerings for deceased rulers, consumed enormous ongoing expenditures that increased with each royal death, while providing no economic returns. The mathematical progression was unsustainable. The kingdom was dedicating ever larger portions of its resources to serving the dead, while neglecting the needs of the living. The mortuary priesthood hierarchies that emerged to manage these cosmic responsibilities became some of the most complex bureaucratic structures ever developed in the ancient world. The high priest of Ra at Heliopolis supervised theological development and training, while the overseer of pyramid construction coordinated the engineering projects that provided eternal residences for royal spirits. Regional administrators managed the agricultural estates that funded mortuary offerings, while specialized ritual performers maintained the daily ceremonies that sustained deceased rulers in their stellar realms. Each position required extensive education and training, creating employment for thousands of religious professionals while establishing institutional frameworks that would influence governmental organization throughout subsequent periods. Religious implications of royal stellar transformation created theological complexities that required careful resolution to maintain social stability. If divine rulers achieved complete godhood through death, what was their condition during earthly life? How could living kings claim divine authority while acknowledging that full divinity came only through death and resurrection? Theological scholars attached to royal courts developed sophisticated explanations that distinguished between potential divinity possessed by living rulers and actualized divinity achieved through proper death and transformation procedures. These theological innovations had profound implications for understanding divine kingship that would influence political theory throughout subsequent periods. Living rulers were divine beings whose full potential would be realized only through death, making royal burial preparation as important as any governmental policy for ensuring continued cosmic order. The kingdom's prosperity depended not just on royal wisdom and administrative competence during earthly life, but on successful royal transformation into stellar deities capable of governing cosmic forces that controlled Nile flooding, agricultural fertility, and protection from foreign enemies. Mortuary priesthoods, established to maintain offerings and rituals for deceased rulers, became permanent institutions that required enormous ongoing expenditures while providing employment for hundreds of specialized religious personnel. These priests performed daily rituals that sustained royal spirits in their stellar residences while facilitating communication between living kings and their transformed predecessors. Through these practices, deceased monarchs continued participating in governmental decisions while providing divine guidance for addressing challenges that exceeded purely human capabilities. When Unis became the first king to have comprehensive instructions for the world beyond carved on his pyramid's interior walls, around 2345 BC, he established precedents that would define royal burial practices for centuries. These pyramid texts represented the oldest religious literature known to human civilization, containing over 700 individual spells and formulas designed to ensure successful royal transformation, while providing protection against dangers that could threaten even divine spirits during their cosmic journeys. The texts revealed sophisticated understanding of post-mortem geography that had developed through centuries of royal burial experimentation. Deceased rulers would encounter multiple challenges requiring different types of magical assistance: dangerous water crossings that demanded special boats, hostile spirits that needed to be defeated or appeased, celestial gatekeepers who required proper passwords, and stellar territories with specific entry requirements. Each challenge had corresponding magical solutions that royal spirits could access through proper knowledge and preparation. Yet access to these powerful resurrection techniques remained strictly limited to royal family members and the highest levels of court hierarchy. Common people continued relying on traditional burial practices that offered preservation and basic post-mortem survival, but not the stellar transformation that would enable participation in cosmic governance. This exclusivity reinforced social hierarchies, while creating incentives for ambitious nobles to demonstrate exceptional loyalty and service that might qualify them for enhanced burial privileges. Regional temples throughout the kingdom began incorporating stellar theology into their local religious traditions, adapting royal afterlife concepts for application to their own divine patrons and community needs. Solar symbolism became increasingly prominent in temple architecture and ritual practices, while stellar imagery appeared in artistic traditions that had previously focused on earthly themes. These developments created religious unity throughout the realm, while establishing theological frameworks that would influence thought for millennia. Master scribes copying and refining pyramid text formulas discovered that certain magical procedures could be adapted for protecting living people as well as deceased spirits. Amulets incorporating stellar symbolism provided divine protection during dangerous travels, while ritual procedures, originally developed for royal resurrection, could offer healing and spiritual enhancement for serious illnesses. These civilian applications of royal death magic created new religious traditions that bridged the gap between royal and popular religious practices. The sophisticated burial preparations that had been developed for royal stellar transformation established technological and artistic standards that would influence civilization's development far beyond mortuary contexts. Precision stone-cutting techniques perfected for pyramid construction enabled architectural achievements throughout the kingdom. Mathematical knowledge developed for astronomical calculations, advanced engineering capabilities, while contributing to commercial and administrative applications. Artistic traditions established in royal workshops influenced aesthetic standards that would characterize this culture's visual expression for thousands of years. By the end of the Old Kingdom period, royal beliefs about death had achieved unprecedented sophistication, while creating institutional foundations that would endure throughout subsequent political upheavals. The conviction that divine rulers could achieve stellar divinity through proper death and transformation procedures had generated architectural, technological, religious, and artistic innovations that established this civilization among humanity's greatest achievements. Yet these very successes had also created expectations and institutional requirements that would prove increasingly difficult to sustain as political and economic conditions changed throughout the kingdom. The chaos began with a single failed flood. In 2181 BC, when the Nile's annual inundation barely reached the lowest irrigation channels, governors throughout the kingdom faced a crisis that would shatter the foundations underlying divine authority. If living kings truly possessed cosmic power over the river's flooding, agricultural fertility, and natural order itself, How could such disasters occur during their reigns? When subsequent years brought continued drought, political rebellion, and social upheaval, ordinary people began questioning whether aristocratic monopoly over stellar transformation was justified or even real. The first intermediate period that followed brought 7 consecutive years of catastrophic flooding failures, during which the Nile's waters receded so far that ancient harbors became mudflats and irrigation systems designed for millennia collapsed entirely. Starving populations abandoned their traditional settlements and migrated toward regions where food might still be available, creating refugee movements that destabilized social structures throughout the kingdom. In this chaos, traditional religious authorities lost credibility as their prayers and offerings failed to restore the cosmic order that royal divine power supposedly guaranteed. Anktifi, a governor ruling territories south of Memphis during these dark decades, commissioned tomb inscriptions that would have been unthinkable during the Old Kingdom's height. His biographical works claimed personal responsibility for feeding the hungry, protecting the weak, and maintaining order, while central authority collapsed around him. More significantly, his burial preparations incorporated formulas previously reserved for kings, suggesting that exceptional individuals might achieve post-mortem transformation through their own merits rather than aristocratic connection. When local priests agreed to perform these enhanced funeral rites, they established precedents that would transform religious practice throughout the realm. The tomb inscriptions Anktifi commissioned revealed the revolution taking place in regional centers as traditional authority crumbled. I was the beginning and the end of mankind, since nobody like me existed before, nor will exist, proclaimed one text that directly appropriated language previously reserved for divine rulers. Another inscription claimed that he had made the children outlive their fathers through his effective governance during the crisis, suggesting that local leadership could provide divine protection that central authority had failed to deliver. These were not mere boasts, but systematic challenges to principles that had justified aristocratic monopoly over cosmic power. Master craftsmen in regional workshops, suddenly freed from central oversight as authority crumbled, began experimenting with burial techniques that had been forbidden to anyone below aristocratic rank. At Beni Hassan, tomb builders developed new approaches to organizing burial chambers that could accommodate extended spell collections while remaining economically accessible to wealthy merchants and local officials. Instead of covering entire walls with costly carved hieroglyphs, they discovered that painted inscriptions on wooden sarcophagus surfaces could provide equivalent protection at a fraction of the expense. These innovations reflected deeper developments that were reshaping understanding of death and eternal transformation throughout the fractured realm. If the cosmos could function despite central weakness, perhaps individual spirits possessed capabilities that didn't depend entirely on aristocratic intercession. Regional priests, no longer constrained by court orthodoxy, began developing procedures that could enable non-aristocratic spirits to navigate the dangerous passages between earthly life and whatever realms awaited beyond death. Sieza, a nomarch governing territories near modern Dashur around 2000 BC, became the first non-aristocratic person to commission a complete set of instructions for his personal transformation. Working with scholars who had fled the abandoned court, he assembled over 400 spells and formulas, specifically adapted for use by someone who possessed neither divine blood nor inherited kingship. These writings, painted in neat hieroglyphic columns inside his massive wooden sarcophagus, represented the first systematic attempt to democratize the knowledge that had previously guaranteed eternal life only for the elite. Regional variations in these coffin text formulas revealed the sophisticated theological adaptations that different provincial centers developed to address local conditions and preferences. The texts from Berkshire emphasized agricultural metaphors appropriate for communities whose prosperity depended on farming, with spells for ensuring adequate water supplies and fertile soil in the cosmic fields where souls would labor eternally. The coffin texts from Mayer incorporated commercial imagery, reflecting that region's importance as a trading center, including magical procedures for securing favorable exchange rates and safe passage for merchant caravans in celestial marketplaces. These variations demonstrated that non-royal resurrection was being systematically adapted to reflect the diverse economic and social realities that characterized provincial life. Spell 1130, which first appeared in coffin texts from this period, provided the most detailed map of underworld geography ever attempted. This remarkable composition described the Duat as containing 12 distinct regions corresponding to the hours of night, each governed by different deities and presenting unique challenges to traveling souls. The spell revealed that deceased spirits would encounter a lake of fire guarded by 4 baboons, a region of upside-down beings who walked on their hands, and territories inhabited by serpents whose names had to be pronounced correctly to secure safe passage. Most importantly, the spell provided specific magical formulas that would enable non-royal souls to navigate these dangers without the automatic divine protection that royal spirits enjoyed. The sarcophagus that contained Sieyes's mummy revealed sophisticated understanding of how traditional elite procedures could be modified for civilian use. Spells originally designed to transform deceased kings into stellar deities were adapted to enable lesser nobles to join the retinues of divine rulers in their celestial realms. Formulas that had provided aristocratic spirits with boats for crossing dangerous waters were adjusted to ensure that non-elite spirits could secure passage on vessels operated by divine boatmen. Most importantly, procedures for appeasing hostile spirits and passing celestial gatekeepers were expanded to include passwords and offerings that ordinary people could afford. Yet these early experiments in democratized transformation revealed problems that required careful resolution. If non-elite spirits could achieve eternal life through their own preparations, what distinguished them from divine kings who had supposedly possessed unique cosmic authority? Scholars working in regional centers developed innovative solutions that preserved aristocratic preeminence while enabling broader participation in eternal existence. Elite spirits would continue ruling celestial realms, but exceptional civilians could join their administrative hierarchies as eternal servants who shared in divine glory without challenging established supremacy. Regional variations in these adapted procedures reflected local conditions and preferences that had been suppressed during the Old Kingdom's centralized orthodoxy. Northern territories, where Memphis priests had developed sophisticated solar theology, emphasized spells that would enable non-elite spirits to join the sun, God's daily journey across the sky. Southern regions, closer to traditional burial grounds where Osiris mythology remained dominant, focused on procedures for gaining admission to the god's realm through proper ethical behavior and ritual preparation. The Duat, that mysterious underworld realm where souls would encounter their greatest trials, achieved unprecedented detailed description in these provincial texts. Unlike royal pyramid texts that had mentioned underworld dangers only briefly, the new magical literature provided comprehensive guides to navigating landscapes filled with hostile serpents, lakes of fire, and divine guardians who controlled access to different regions. Commoner souls, lacking the automatic divine protection that royal spirits enjoyed, required much more detailed instructions for surviving challenges that could destroy inadequately prepared travelers. Master painters working on these elaborate coffin decorations developed artistic traditions that would influence religious expression for centuries. Instead of the formal royal iconography that had dominated official art, they created more personal imagery that reflected individual hopes and fears about post-mortem survival. Scenes of agricultural abundance suggested that eternity would involve perfected versions of earthly activities, while depictions of family reunions implied that social relationships would continue beyond death. Most significantly, these artistic programs began including moral evaluations that determined post-mortem destinations based on earthly conduct rather than social rank. Gua, a physician whose coffin text survived from around 1900 BC, commissioned magical procedures specifically adapted for someone whose earthly career had involved healing others and studying medical knowledge. His resurrection spells emphasized intellectual capabilities that would enable him to continue practicing medicine in celestial realms, while his passwords for underworld gatekeepers referenced anatomical knowledge that demonstrated professional competence. These personalized adaptations revealed growing understanding that post-mortem survival would involve continuing the activities and relationships that had defined earthly identity. The theological implications of these developments created tensions between provincial innovation and traditional royal prerogatives that required careful negotiation. Regional priests who enabled non-royal resurrection needed to avoid direct challenges to royal divine authority while providing their patrons with genuine hope for eternal survival. Their solutions emphasized service and loyalty to divine rulers as requirements for post-mortem advancement, ensuring that democratized resurrection would reinforce rather than undermine cosmic hierarchies. Economic factors driving these religious changes reflected broader social transformations that were reshaping the kingdom's political structure. Provincial wealthy families who had accumulated resources during the central government's weakness could afford elaborate burial preparations that had previously been available only to royal relatives. Local craftsmen and priests who had lost royal patronage discovered that serving regional elites could provide comparable economic opportunities, while enabling artistic and theological innovation that court restrictions had prevented. The emergence of Nut as a central protective deity in these texts reflected growing emphasis on maternal care and nurturing that would sustain souls during their dangerous post-mortem journeys. Unlike the masculine solar deities who had dominated royal theology, Nut offered protection that seemed more accessible to ordinary people who lacked claims to cosmic authority. Her imagery, a star-covered woman arching over the earth to protect the dead during their nightly travels, provided comfort and reassurance that balanced the terrifying dangers described in underworld geography. Trade relationships between different provincial centers enabled the exchange of magical innovations that enriched local traditions while creating increasingly standardized approaches to non-royal resurrection. Spell formulas developed in one region could be adapted for use elsewhere, while artistic techniques pioneered in particular workshops influenced decoration throughout the kingdom. These connections ensured that democratization of death magic proceeded according to similar principles, despite political fragmentation that prevented centralized coordination. The negative confession, which first appeared in coffin texts from this period, represented the most significant theological innovation in the democratization process. This systematic listing of 42 sins that souls needed to deny before divine judges established moral conduct as a fundamental requirement for post-mortem survival. Unlike royal resurrection, which had depended primarily on proper magical procedures and divine blood, commoner salvation required ethical behavior that could be evaluated through detailed examination of earthly actions. Each sin listed in the negative confession corresponded to specific moral obligations that governed daily life in provincial communities. while also reflecting the 42 nomes that comprise the administrative geography of the kingdom. I have not stolen food reflected economic ethics in societies where resource scarcity created constant temptations for theft. I have not caused anyone to weep emphasized emotional responsibility in closely connected communities, where individual actions affected collective welfare. I have not committed adultery, reinforced social bonds that maintained family stability in uncertain times. I have not closed my ears to words of truth, established intellectual honesty as a divine requirement, while I have not been aggressive, prohibited the violence that could destabilize fragile provincial communities. The theological sophistication of these ethical requirements revealed careful thought about what kinds of behavior would create stable, prosperous communities that could survive without strong central authority. The confession's emphasis on honesty in commercial dealings reflected the importance of trade relationships for provincial prosperity, while its prohibitions against sexual misconduct reinforced family structures that provided social stability during political chaos. Most remarkably, the confession required souls to deny harming the environment. I have not polluted the water, and I have not driven cattle from their pastures, establishing environmental responsibility as a divine mandate that anticipated modern ecological thinking by millennia. Middle Kingdom literature emerging from these same provincial centers reflected changing attitudes toward death that complemented the magical innovations appearing in burial contexts. The dialogue of a man with his soul explored philosophical questions about whether post-mortem survival was worth the effort required to achieve it, while the tale of the eloquent peasant suggested that moral behavior would be rewarded even when earthly justice failed. These literary works provided frameworks for understanding individual responsibility that supported the ethical requirements embedded in new magical procedures. The admonitions of Ipuwer provided the most detailed contemporary account of the social chaos that had enabled these theological innovations. This remarkable text described a world turned upside down, where the servant takes what he finds, and the poor have become rich while the wealthy have nothing. Most significantly for religious development, the text complained that the secrets of the embalmers are laid bare, and what the pyramid concealed is now empty, indicating that royal mortuary knowledge had become accessible to unauthorized persons. These passages confirm that theological democratization involved not just adaptation of royal procedures, but actual theft of closely guarded ritual secrets. The literary masterpiece known as The Instructions of Amenemhotep established moral frameworks that would influence ethical thinking throughout the ancient world and eventually contribute to biblical wisdom literature. This text emphasized personal responsibility, social justice, and divine judgment in language that perfectly complemented the ethical requirements appearing in contemporary coffin texts. Do not move the boundary stones of a widow, and do not accept bribes, provided practical moral guidance that supported the systematic ethical evaluation described in mortuary literature. Regional Osiris centers that had been overshadowed by royal solar theology during the Old Kingdom experienced remarkable revivals as provincial elites sought divine patrons who seemed more accessible than distant stellar deities. Temples at Memphis, Osiris, and other traditional sites received generous donations from local rulers who hoped to secure divine favor for their own post-mortem journeys. These investments enabled expanded temple services while creating employment for priests who specialized in adapting Osirian theology for non-royal patrons. The Memphis theological tradition that emerged during this period created the most sophisticated synthesis of Osirian mythology with practical resurrection procedures that non-royal souls could realistically achieve. Memphis priests developed the concept of Osiris as Kentia Mentiu, foremost of the Westerners, who would personally evaluate each soul's worthiness for admission to his kingdom based on earthly conduct rather than royal blood. This theological innovation required detailed procedures for moral evaluation that went far beyond the simple magical procedures that had characterized royal resurrection. Souls would need to demonstrate not just knowledge of correct passwords and protective spells, but evidence of ethical behavior that qualified them for eternal reward. The Osiris variant of Osirian theology emphasized the god's role as agricultural deity, whose death and resurrection ensured annual renewal of crops throughout the kingdom. Provincial communities, whose prosperity depended on farming, found this agricultural imagery much more relevant than the stellar transformations that had characterized royal theology. Osiris priests developed elaborate ritual cycles that connected individual resurrection with seasonal renewal, suggesting that souls who had contributed to agricultural prosperity during earthly life would continue that vital work in perfected form throughout eternity. The concept of moral behavior as a factor in post-mortem survival created new social pressures that influenced conduct throughout provincial communities. Local officials who hoped for eternal reward needed to demonstrate justice and compassion in their earthly governance, while merchants who sought post-mortem prosperity had to maintain honest business practices. These expectations encouraged ethical behavior while providing frameworks for social criticism when leaders failed to meet moral standards. Artistic depictions of the underworld that appeared in provincial tomb decorations revealed sophisticated understanding of post-mortem geography that had developed through centuries of theological speculation. The Duat was portrayed as a complex landscape containing multiple regions with different characteristics and inhabitants. Souls would encounter serpentine guardians who controlled access to specific areas, divine ferrymen who provided transportation across dangerous waters, and celestial officials who evaluated moral qualifications for advancement to higher realms. The integration of traditional Osiris mythology with newer magical procedures created theological syntheses that would influence religious development for centuries. Osiris remained the supreme judge of the dead, whose resurrection provided the model for human survival, but access to his kingdom now required moral qualifications, rather than simply royal blood or magical knowledge. The god's own experience of death, dismemberment, and restoration became a template that ordinary people could follow through proper ethical conduct and burial preparation. Provincial workshops producing burial equipment for these enhanced commoner funerals developed manufacturing techniques that balanced magical effectiveness with economic accessibility. Canopic jars could be carved from local limestone rather than imported granite, while magical amulets could be produced from bronze or faience rather than precious metals. These innovations enabled broader participation in elaborate burial traditions while maintaining the theological principles that made such preparations effective. The success of these provincial experiments in democratized resurrection attracted attention from royal authorities who were struggling to restore central control as the Middle Kingdom emerged from political chaos. Rather than suppress these innovations, successive rulers chose to incorporate them into official religious practice, while reasserting royal supremacy over theological development. This accommodation enabled continued innovation while preventing religious challenges to royal authority that might have threatened political reunification. Mentuhotep II's approach to managing this theological revolution revealed sophisticated political understanding of how religious innovation could be controlled rather than simply suppressed. His royal inscriptions claimed credit for restoring what had been destroyed, and reuniting what had been separated, language that applied to both political reunification and theological synthesis. By positioning himself as the patron of religious restoration, rather than the opponent of theological innovation, he enabled continued development of democratized resurrection, while ensuring that royal authority retained ultimate oversight over religious development. This strategy proved remarkably successful, creating frameworks for theological innovation that would flourish throughout the Middle Kingdom, while maintaining royal supremacy over cosmic order. When Mentuhotep II successfully reunited the kingdom around 2055 BC, he inherited religious traditions that had been fundamentally transformed during the decades of political fragmentation. Non-royal people throughout the realm now possessed access to magical procedures that could ensure post-mortem survival, while moral conduct had become recognized as a legitimate requirement for eternal reward. Royal resurrection remained supreme, but it now existed within broader frameworks that acknowledged individual responsibility and divine justice. The establishment of new royal workshops at Thebes during the early Middle Kingdom required integration of provincial innovations with traditional royal prerogatives in ways that preserved both elite access to enhanced magical procedures and royal supremacy over theological development. Master craftsmen who had developed techniques for non-royal burials were recruited to serve royal patrons, while provincial priests who had pioneered ethical evaluations were incorporated into court religious hierarchies. These appointments enabled continued innovation while ensuring royal control over theological developments. Literary production flourishing during the restored kingdom reflected confidence in post-mortem survival that extended beyond royal circles for the first time in centuries. The instructions of Amenemhotep provided moral guidance that would influence ethical thinking throughout the ancient world, while the story of Sinuhe explored themes of exile and return that resonated with souls hoping for successful navigation of post-mortem journeys. These works established literary traditions that would influence religious and philosophical thinking for millennia. By the end of the Middle Kingdom period, death had been transformed from an exclusive royal privilege into a universal human challenge that could be successfully met through moral conduct, magical preparation, and divine assistance. The theological innovations that had emerged during political chaos had been refined and systematized to create frameworks for post-mortem survival that acknowledged both individual responsibility and divine authority. Commoners throughout the kingdom now possessed hope for eternal life, while royal supremacy over cosmic order remained intact. The stage was set for even more dramatic developments that would create the most elaborate vision of life beyond death that human civilization would ever achieve. The magical procedures pioneered in provincial workshops would evolve into comprehensive guidebooks for navigating every challenge that souls might encounter during their post-mortem journeys. The moral requirements established through ethical evaluation would develop into systematic judgment processes that would influence concepts of divine justice throughout subsequent religious traditions. Most importantly, the democratization of resurrection would create popular demand for magical knowledge that would drive innovation for the next 1,000 years. The scribe Ani bent over his papyrus scroll in the lamplit workshop at Thebes around 1250 BC, carefully painting the most important purchase of his lifetime. Each hieroglyph had to be perfect, every illustration precisely positioned, for this document would guide his spirit through the terrifying landscape of death toward eternal paradise in the field of reeds. Unlike the stone-carved formulas that had served kings in their pyramids, or the wooden sarcophagus inscriptions that had protected Middle Kingdom nobles, his scroll represented something revolutionary, a portable guidebook that could accompany any person wealthy enough to afford it through every challenge that awaited beyond the grave. The papyrus industry that had emerged during the New Kingdom's prosperity created unprecedented opportunities for ordinary people to acquire the protective knowledge that had once been reserved for the highest levels of society. Master papermakers along the Nile had perfected techniques for producing writing material in standardized lengths and qualities, while scribal workshops offered customized burial documents adapted to their clients' specific needs and financial capabilities. A wealthy merchant like the scribe could afford a deluxe scroll containing nearly 200 individual chapters, while a modest craftsman might purchase a basic version with only the most essential formulas for navigating the underworld's greatest dangers. Workshops in the capital had become the center of this booming industry, employing hundreds of specialized scribes, artists, and religious consultants who collaborated to produce burial documents of unprecedented sophistication. Each scroll began with extensive consultations to determine the client's particular needs, or fears and aspirations for their existence beyond death. A physician might require formulas emphasizing healing capabilities that would enable continued medical practice in celestial realms, while a farmer might prioritize text, ensuring abundant harvests in divine agricultural territories. Military officers commissioned chapters focusing on leadership and safety, while merchants sought guarantees of profitable trading relationships with celestial suppliers. The artistic programs accompanying these personalized collections revealed the full flowering of religious imagination that had been developing for over 1,000 years. Master painters created miniature masterpieces illustrating every stage of the journey that spirits would undertake from death to everlasting reward. Unlike the formal, standardized imagery that had characterized earlier periods, these illustrations reflected individual personalities and concerns while maintaining the power that made them functional rather than merely decorative. Chapter 17, which appeared in virtually every version, regardless of length or cost, presented the most comprehensive examination that any spirit would face during their post-mortem journey. This remarkable composition took the form of a cosmic quiz, in which the deceased had to demonstrate complete understanding of creation mythology, celestial genealogies, and the complex relationships between different heavenly realms. Who is he whose eyebrows are the arms of the balance on the night when evaluation is made? Demanded one question, to which the correct answer revealed knowledge of the ibis-headed god's role in weighing hearts against the feather of truth. Incorrect responses could result in immediate destruction, making this chapter essential for anyone seeking everlasting reward. The version from the capital differed significantly from Memphite variants, reflecting regional preferences that had persisted despite political unification under the New Kingdom. Priests in the capital emphasized solar theology that connected individual change with the daily rebirth of the sun god, while Memphite traditions focused on Ptah's creative powers and the technical skills required for celestial craftsmanship. These differences weren't merely academic, but had practical implications for how spirits would navigate heavenly bureaucracies, where different deities held authority over specific regions and activities. The scribe's document contained the complete text of chapter 125, the famous evaluation scene that represented the climactic moment of every spirit's post-mortem journey. This elaborate composition described in minute detail the Hall of Two Truths, where the resurrected God presided over the cosmic court that would determine each person's ultimate destiny. The hall contained 42 assessors, each representing one of the administrative districts that comprised the earthly realm, who would evaluate different aspects of the deceased's character and behavior during their lifetime. The weighing ritual that formed the centerpiece of this evaluation process had evolved far beyond the simple techniques described in earlier periods. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, would place the deceased's heart on one side of a golden balance scale, while positioning the feather of Ma'at, representing cosmic truth and justice, on the other side. But this wasn't merely a mechanical process. The heart itself would testify about its owner's character, potentially contradicting any false claims about righteous behavior during earthly life. The ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing served as court recorder, whose mathematical precision ensured absolutely accurate evaluation of each heart's weight. His role extended beyond simple record-keeping to include verification of the deceased's knowledge and ritual readiness. Spirits who had failed to master essential formulas or who possessed inadequate understanding of celestial protocols would be exposed through his examination, regardless of their conduct during earthly existence. The monster, Amit, devourer of the dead, waited beside the evaluation scale to consume hearts that proved heavier than the feather of truth. This composite creature, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, represented complete annihilation for spirits who failed the assessment process. Unlike earlier concepts of punishment that had involved temporary suffering or exclusion from celestial realms, Amit's consumption meant total destruction of personal identity and consciousness. Such spirits would not simply fail to achieve everlasting reward, they would cease to exist entirely. Yet Chapter 125 also provided detailed instructions for avoiding this terrifying fate through proper preparation and truthful living. The text included a comprehensive list of declarations that spirits could make to demonstrate their worthiness for eternal reward. I have not killed sacred animals. I have not diverted water in its course. I have not acted with violence against my family. These declarations went far beyond the basic ethical requirements that had characterized earlier periods to include sophisticated understanding of environmental responsibility, social justice, and religious obligation. The vignettes illustrating Chapter 125, in high-quality scrolls like Ani's, revealed artistic traditions that had achieved unprecedented sophistication in depicting invisible spiritual realities. The Judgment Hall was portrayed as a magnificent architectural space that combined elements from the greatest temples, with cosmic symbolism representing universal divine authority. Osiris appeared enthroned in mummy wrappings that emphasized his resurrection, while wearing the Atef crown that demonstrated his supreme judicial authority over all spirits seeking eternal existence. Chapter 6, which dealt with Shabti figures that would perform agricultural labor in the field of reeds, reflected practical concerns about what eternal existence would actually involve. These magical servants, placed in tombs as small mummified figures, would respond to work assignments in celestial agricultural territories by declaring, "O Shabti, if the deceased is called upon to do any work that is done in the realm of the dead, you shall say, 'Here I am,' when you are counted for any task." This formula ensured that blessed spirits could enjoy eternal leisure, while their magical servants handled the mundane activities required for maintaining divine agricultural productivity. The field of reeds itself was described in texts and illustrations as a perfected version of the Nile Valley, where agricultural abundance exceeded anything possible in earthly existence. Canals flowed with pure water that never failed to provide adequate irrigation, while crops grew to unprecedented heights without requiring fertilization or protection from pests. Spirits who successfully reached this paradise would own estates far larger than any earthly property, worked by tireless Shabti servants who could perform every agricultural task with supernatural efficiency. Yet access to this paradise required more than simply surviving the judgment process. Spirits needed detailed knowledge of celestial geography and divine protocols that govern travel through different regions of the afterworld. The Amduat, a parallel text tradition that had developed specifically for guidance, provided hour-by-hour descriptions of the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld's 12 regions. Spirits who joined this divine procession would encounter hostile serpents, lakes of fire, and divine gatekeepers who controlled access to specific areas. The most dangerous challenges occurred during the 7th hour of night, when the solar bark would encounter Apep, the cosmic serpent whose destruction of divine order threatened the continuation of existence itself. This monstrous entity, sometimes described as stretching for hundreds of kilometers through the underworld's deepest regions, sought to devour the sun god and prevent the dawn's renewal. Spirits traveling with the divine procession needed specific magical weapons and protective formulas to survive this encounter, while contributing to the cosmic battle that determined whether creation would continue. Provincial variations in Book of the Dead texts reflected local preferences and economic capabilities that had persisted despite increased standardization during the New Kingdom period. Scrolls produced in northern workshops emphasized Memphis theological traditions that connected individual transformation with Ptah's creative activities and technical craftsmanship. Southern versions reflected Theban preferences for solar imagery and direct association with the royal mortuary complexes that dominated the west bank of the Nile, opposite the Great Temple of Karnak. Economic stratification determined not only the length and quality of scrolls that different social levels could afford, but also the specific magical assistance they could access during their post-mortem journeys. Wealthy individuals, like Annie, could commission scrolls containing detailed maps of underworld geography, comprehensive lists of divine names and passwords, and elaborate protective spells that would ease every aspect of their celestial travels. Modest purchasers received abbreviated versions focusing on essential survival techniques while omitting the sophisticated magical procedures that would enable rapid advancement through divine hierarchies. The papyrus quality itself reflected these economic distinctions in ways that had direct magical implications. Premium scrolls were produced from the finest papyrus fibers that created smooth surfaces capable of supporting detailed illustrations and crisp hieroglyphic writing. Inferior grades contained imperfections that could affect the magical effectiveness of spells, while creating ambiguities in critical protective formulas. Since magical procedures required absolute accuracy to provide intended benefits, papyrus quality became a factor determining post-mortem success rather than merely aesthetic preference. Scribal workshops developed sophisticated quality control procedures to ensure that even modest scrolls contained accurate magical information despite their abbreviated content. Master scribes supervised apprentices who copied standard spell formulas, while specialized proofreaders verified the accuracy of religious texts before final illustration. These procedures enabled mass production of burial documents while maintaining the theological precision that made them magically effective rather than simply decorative. The role of Anubis in guiding spirits through their initial post-mortem challenges had evolved far beyond his traditional association with mummification and burial procedures. Chapter 151 described his function as psychopomp, who would meet newly deceased spirits at the boundary between earthly existence and the celestial realms, providing orientation and protection during the most vulnerable period of their cosmic journey. His intimate knowledge of underworld geography and divine protocols made him an essential ally for spirits who lacked the automatic divine protection that had characterized earlier elite afterlife experiences. Professional mourners who performed funeral ceremonies for wealthy clients like Annie had developed elaborate ritual traditions that activated the magical procedures described in burial scrolls. These ceremonies involved not simply reading the written spells, but performing specific actions that would awaken their protective powers, while establishing connections between the deceased and divine forces that would assist their post-mortem transformation. The quality and accuracy of these performances could significantly influence the effectiveness of even the most sophisticated magical preparations. Temple workshops throughout the kingdom began producing standardized magical equipment that complemented the guidance provided in Book of the Dead scrolls. Heart scarabs inscribed with Chapter 30b provided backup protection during the judgment process by preventing hearts from testifying against their owners, despite any ethical failures during earthly life. These amulets bore specific magical formulas. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my existence, do not stand up against me as witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Canopic jar sets produced during this period achieved unprecedented artistic sophistication while maintaining the functional requirements that enabled proper preservation of internal organs. The four sons of Horus, Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebesenuef, were depicted with increasing attention to individual characteristics that reflected their specialized responsibilities for protecting different organs during the mummification process and subsequent resurrection procedures. These divine guardians would ensure that preserved organs could be successfully reintegrated into perfected spiritual bodies that would function throughout eternal existence. The democratic character of New Kingdom afterlife beliefs created unprecedented opportunities for personal religious expression while maintaining the hierarchical structures that preserved social order in celestial realms. Ordinary people could now aspire to eternal paradise through proper preparation and ethical behavior, but their afterlife experiences would reflect the social positions they had occupied during earthly existence. Craftsmen would continue practicing their trades in perfected workshops, farmers would cultivate divine agricultural territories, and scribes would maintain celestial administrative records. This democratization created new pressures for ethical behavior that influenced social relationships throughout New Kingdom society. Individuals who hoped for favorable judgment needed to demonstrate genuine concern for community welfare, honest business practices, and responsible family relationships that would withstand divine scrutiny. The prospect of eternal reward or annihilation provided powerful incentives for maintaining social harmony, while creating frameworks for criticizing leaders who failed to meet appropriate standards. Literary traditions flourishing during the New Kingdom period reflected the confidence in personal afterlife achievement that had emerged from widespread access to protective magical knowledge. The Tale of Two Brothers explored themes of death, resurrection, and divine justice that resonated with contemporary religious beliefs, while the contendings of Horus and Seth provided detailed accounts of the cosmic conflicts that determined succession to divine authority. These works established narrative frameworks that influenced understanding of individual spiritual journeys, while entertainment that made serious religious concepts accessible to broad audiences. Religious festivals celebrating divine deaths and resurrections became increasingly elaborate public spectacles that enabled entire communities to participate in the cosmic cycles that governed individual post-mortem transformation. The Osiris festivals at Abydos attracted pilgrims from throughout the kingdom who sought to witness the god's annual resurrection while establishing spiritual connections that would benefit their own eternal journeys. These celebrations created shared religious experiences that reinforced community bonds while providing practical education about the afterlife procedures that everyone would eventually need. By the end of the New Kingdom period, the Book of the Dead had achieved the status of essential equipment for anyone seeking successful post-mortem transformation. The scroll industry had created standardized procedures for producing magical guidance adapted to different social levels and economic capabilities, while artistic traditions had evolved sophisticated techniques for illustrating spiritual realities that transcended ordinary human experience. Most importantly, the detailed instructions provided in these texts had democratized access to eternal paradise, while maintaining the divine justice that rewarded ethical behavior and punished moral failures. The stage was set for even more elaborate developments that would refine these procedures while adapting them to changing political and cultural conditions. The comprehensive magical knowledge that had been systematized in Book of the Dead Scrolls would provide the foundation for innovations that would influence religious thinking throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The judgment procedures that had been perfected during this period would establish concepts of divine justice that would shape legal and ethical thinking for millennia to come. The mineral salt crystals crunched beneath Camwaset's sandals as he descended into the drying beds beside the sacred lake at Memphis around 1280 BC. For 70 days, the body of the recently deceased nobleman Amenhotep had been packed in these deposits, slowly transforming from mortal flesh into something approaching divine permanence. As chief processor for the most prestigious facility in the capital, Camwaset understood that his craft represented humanity's most audacious challenge to the natural order. The systematic conquest of decay through chemical knowledge and precise procedures. The salt mines at Wadi el Natron, located in the desert west of the delta, provided the essential ingredient that made this conquest possible. These natural deposits of sodium carbonate, formed through millennia of evaporation from ancient lake beds, possessed properties that had been discovered accidentally by desert peoples who observed how corpses interred in these areas achieved remarkable conservation. Trade caravans carrying the precious mineral to facilities throughout the kingdom created supply networks that enabled body processing to spread far beyond the royal centers where it had originated centuries earlier. Geographic limitations imposed by mineral availability created hierarchies of conservation quality that reflected both economic constraints and practical logistics. Facilities located near major deposits could afford to use enormous quantities of the precious substance, packing corpses completely while replacing used chemicals multiple times during the drying cycle. Distant regions relied on smaller quantities that required careful recycling and resulted in less perfect conservation, creating regional variations in processing quality that would influence post-mortem success rates. Camwaset's facility had developed methods that represented the pinnacle of embalming science, refined through generations of experimentation and innovation. The procedure began with surgical removal of internal organs through a small incision in the left side of the abdomen, an operation that required intimate anatomical knowledge and surgical precision. The brain was extracted through the nasal passages, using bronze hooks that could navigate the complex passages, while avoiding damage to facial features that needed to remain recognizable for K recognition. Each organ received specialized treatment according to its significance and conservation requirements. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were individually cleaned, treated with oils and resins, then swathed in linen before placement in canopic jars guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, remained within the body cavity, for it would be required during the weighing ceremony that determined post-mortem destiny. Removing the heart would eliminate any possibility of successful rebirth, making this organ's conservation within the mummy absolutely essential for existence beyond death. The chemical transformations involved in body processing represented sophisticated understanding of decomposition and its prevention that had been accumulated through centuries of practical experimentation. Different resins imported from frankincense trees in Punt provided antimicrobial properties that prevented bacterial growth, while aromatic oils from cedar trees created protective barriers against moisture that could restart decay. Palm wine, used for internal cleansing, possessed alcohol content that further inhibited decomposition while providing ceremonial purification that satisfied religious requirements. Temperature and humidity control within drying spaces required engineering innovations that pushed ancient technology to its limits. Facility designers created underground areas with carefully calculated ventilation systems that maintained optimal conditions for desiccation while preventing the excessive drying that could damage tissues. Stone-lined compartments provided thermal mass that moderated temperature fluctuations, while strategically positioned air shafts created circulation patterns that removed moisture without creating drafts that might disturb the delicate drying operation. Quality gradations in conservation services reflected economic realities that determined access to superior processing methods. Kemwaset's facility offered premium treatments that could require 6 months of specialized labor and cost the equivalent of several years' income for skilled craftsmen. These elaborate procedures involved multiple applications of expensive resins, intricate binding patterns using the finest linen, and detailed facial reconstruction that maintained lifelike appearance. Modest conservation services provided basic treatment using recycled chemicals and simple linen coverings that ensured adequate preservation without the refinements that enhanced capabilities for the next world. The binding operation that concluded body processing involved far more than simple bandaging. It represented a systematic reconstruction of celestial anatomy according to heavenly principles. Hundreds of meters of linen strips were applied in precise patterns that corresponded to star maps and cosmic proportions, creating a textile architecture that would facilitate transformation beyond death. Amulets placed between binding layers provided specific protections. Scarab beetles over the heart to ensure favorable testimony during judgment. Djed pillars along the spine to guarantee structural integrity. Tie-at knots at the throat to maintain connection between body and soul. Deir el-Medina, the village that housed workers constructing royal sepulchres in the Valley of the Kings, provided unprecedented insights into how ordinary people understood and planned for death during the New Kingdom period. Papyrus documents conserved in the village's dry environment revealed the personal concerns of craftsmen who spent their professional lives creating eternal residences for rulers while planning their own more modest posthumous accommodations. Strike records from the village showed that workers would abandon royal projects when their own wages were delayed, demonstrating that personal survival concerns took precedence even over service to royalty. Ramose, a master sculptor whose sepulchre survives near the village, commissioned plans that revealed the sophisticated understanding of otherworldly requirements that had developed among skilled workers. His resting place incorporated building elements borrowed from royal monuments. A vaulted ceiling decorated with astronomical imagery, wall paintings depicting the departed's journey through underworld regions, and storage niches for the extensive grave goods required for existence beyond death. Yet the scale and substances reflected economic constraints that required creative adaptation of royal methods for civilian budgets. The robbery papyri from Deir el-Medina revealed the moral complexities created by economic inequalities in posthumous arrangements. Workers who had devoted their lives to creating magnificent eternal residences for rulers often lacked resources for their own adequate conservation, creating temptations for theft that could provide equipment for superior personal interment. court records documented elaborate networks of thieves who systematically plundered royal and noble resting places to supply the black market in high-quality conservation supplies and grave goods. These theft operations demonstrated intimate knowledge of monument construction and interment practices that could only have been acquired through professional involvement in the mortuary industry. Thieves knew exactly which areas contained the most valuable equipment, which bindings concealed precious amulets, and which possessions possessed the greatest power for the next world. The systematic nature of these operations suggested that robbery had become an organized industry that redistributed mortuary wealth from elite interments to the broader population seeking adequate posthumous readiness. Economic contracts conserved in Deir el-Medina archives revealed the complex financial arrangements required for maintaining posthumous welfare indefinitely. Families established trusts that would provide offerings to departed relatives for specific periods, while professional mourning societies contracted to perform memorial observances that would sustain connections between the living and the dead. These arrangements created ongoing economic relationships that extended family obligations across generations while providing employment for religious specialists. The mortuary complex of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri represented building innovation that integrated monument construction with broader landscape features to create cosmic symbolism. The structure's terraced design followed natural cliff formations, while creating artificial gardens that represented the agricultural abundance awaiting the departed in paradise. Ramps connecting different levels symbolized the gradual ascent that souls would make towards celestial destinations, while the sanctuary, carved directly into the cliff face, provided a physical gateway between earthly and heavenly realms. Sealing observances that concluded interment arrangements involved complex procedures designed to activate the protections embedded in building and artistic programs. Professional priests performed specific actions that would awaken guardian spirits carved into monument walls, energize protective formulas inscribed throughout resting areas, and establish the barriers that would prevent unauthorized access to posthumous accommodations. These observances represented the final separation between the departed and earthly existence, marking their transition into the realm where different laws and relationships would govern their continued existence. The Valley of the Kings became the ultimate expression of New Kingdom monument architecture, representing royal interment traditions that had evolved to unprecedented sophistication. Each sepulchre, carved into the valley's limestone cliffs, followed building programs that recreated the cosmic geography described in underworld books, while providing practical accommodations for the elaborate equipment required for royal rebirth. Corridors descended at specific angles that corresponded to stellar alignments, while areas positioned according to cardinal directions created orientation systems that would guide royal souls through their cosmic journeys. Building symbolism embedded in royal monument design reflected detailed understanding of the processes that would occur within these spaces after interment. Entrance corridors represented the initial descent into death that all souls experienced, while successive areas corresponded to different stages of posthumous change. The resting area itself was conceived as a rebirth machine, where royal mummies would undergo the transformations that would enable their emergence as celestial beings capable of cosmic authority. Artistic programs decorating monument walls served functional rather than merely aesthetic purposes, providing visual guides for souls navigating posthumous challenges, while creating environments that would facilitate successful change. Scenes from the Book of the Dead illustrated specific operations that the departed would need to perform, while depictions of celestial encounters provided recognition images that would enable proper identification of helpful versus hostile supernatural beings. Text and image combined to create comprehensive instruction manuals carved permanently into the monument architecture. Workers' quarters, established near royal monument construction sites, revealed the enormous human resources required for these building achievements. Thousands of skilled craftsmen, laborers, and support personnel were employed for decades-long projects that pushed ancient engineering capabilities to their absolute limits. Quarrying, transport, and construction methods developed for monument building influenced architectural capabilities throughout the kingdom, while creating employment opportunities that attracted skilled workers from throughout the known world. The four sons of Horus represented the most sophisticated example of how canopic jar evolution reflected advancing understanding of organ conservation and anatomy for the next world. Imseti, with his human head, protected the liver while overseeing the emotional aspects of personality that would need reconstruction during rebirth. Hapi, depicted with baboon features, guarded the lungs while managing the breath of life that would reanimate bodies beyond death. Duamutev, shown with jackal characteristics, watched over the stomach while controlling the appetite that would sustain souls throughout eternity. Kebesenuev, portrayed with falcon attributes, protected the intestines while governing the digestive operations that would enable consumption of celestial food. Each guardian possessed specific capabilities that extended beyond simple conservation to include active assistance during the rebirth operation. Their names and images carved on canopic jars created contracts that obligated these deities to provide aid and guidance when their human charges attempted posthumous change. The quality of workmanship in canopic jar production could significantly influence the effectiveness of this celestial assistance, making superior craftsmanship a factor in success beyond death, rather than merely aesthetic preference. Animal processing practices that flourished during the New Kingdom period revealed expanding concepts of which beings possess souls capable of posthumous survival. Holy animals associated with major complexes received conservation treatments comparable to those provided for wealthy humans, while pets belonging to elite families were processed and interred with their owners to ensure continued companionship throughout eternity. These practices demonstrated growing recognition that capabilities for the next world extended beyond humanity to include other forms of consciousness that deserved conservation and respect. The processing of holy bulls at Memphis required specialized methods adapted for conserving massive forms, weighing several tons, while maintaining the anatomical integrity necessary for functioning beyond death. These operations involved teams of specialists working for months to remove and preserve internal organs, apply conservation treatments to massive quantities of tissue, and create binding systems capable of supporting enormous weight without compromising structural stability. The economic resources devoted to these projects revealed the enormous significance attributed to celestial animal conservation. Regional processing traditions that had developed independently in different parts of the kingdom created variations in method and quality that reflected local resources, cultural preferences, and economic capabilities. Northern facilities, influenced by Memphis traditions, emphasized chemical conservation methods that produced superior tissue integrity, while southern centers near Thebes developed binding approaches that created more elaborate external appearances. These regional differences influenced the capabilities that different social groups could achieve through their posthumous arrangements. Professional associations among processors created standardized training programs that ensured consistent quality while protecting trade secrets that gave established facilities competitive advantages. Master craftsmen apprenticed promising students through years-long programs that covered anatomy, chemistry, observance management, and business practices necessary for successful careers. These educational systems created professional communities that maintained technical standards while advancing innovations that improved conservation capabilities. Economic specialization within the processing industry enabled unprecedented efficiency in production, while reducing costs that made adequate conservation accessible to broader social groups. Facilities developed assembly line approaches where different specialists handled specific aspects of the conservation operation, from initial surgical work through final binding and decoration. This division of labor enabled master craftsmen to focus on the most technically demanding aspects, while training less skilled workers to handle routine operations. Competition between different processing centers drove innovation that improved conservation methods, while expanding the range of services available to clients with varying financial capabilities. Facilities advertised their special approaches, superior substances, and distinguished clientele to attract customers willing to pay premium prices for enhanced security beyond death. This commercial competition created pressure for continuous improvement that advanced the technical capabilities of the entire industry. Storage areas developed to house mummies awaiting interment or transport required engineering solutions that provided adequate safety while accommodating the enormous volumes of processed remains produced by busy facilities. Warehouses with climate control systems maintained optimal humidity and temperature conditions that prevented deterioration during storage periods that could extend for months or years. Inventory management systems tracked individual mummies through complex production operations, while ensuring that remains were delivered to correct interment sites with appropriate grave goods and documentation. Transportation networks that moved mummies from processing facilities to interment sites required specialized equipment and methods that maintained body integrity during journeys that could cover hundreds of kilometers. Purpose-built vessels with cushioned compartments transported mummies along the Nile, while specially designed sledges enabled overland movement to monument sites in desert regions. Professional transport crews developed expertise in handling processed remains that ensured safe delivery, while maintaining the dignity appropriate for beings destined for celestial change. By the end of the New Kingdom period, body processing had evolved from an exclusive royal privilege into a sophisticated industry serving clients throughout society. Technical innovations had improved conservation quality while reducing costs. Artistic traditions had created interment equipment of unprecedented beauty and power for the next world. And building achievements had produced eternal residences that rivaled celestial palaces in their grandeur. Most importantly, these developments had created comprehensive systems that enabled ordinary people to achieve the physical conservation necessary for successful rebirth, while maintaining social hierarchies that preserved order in both earthly and heavenly realms. The Nubian king, Pa, stood before the great shrine at Memphis in 730 BC, performing the ancient opening of the mouth ceremony for a sacred Apis bull whose death had plunged the capital into mourning. This black-skinned conqueror from the south, who had swept northward to claim dominion over a fractured realm, understood that legitimacy required more than military victory. It demanded demonstrating mastery over the complex observances that governed life and death throughout the Nile Valley. As he spoke the formulas that would ensure the bull's rebirth in celestial pastures, Paye was participating in a synthesis that would transform Nilotic concepts through contact with external influences and foreign rulers. The political fragmentation that had characterized the late period created opportunities for external influences that would have been impossible during the centralized New Kingdom. When Assyrian armies conquered Memphis in 671 BC, they discovered ceremonial customs so sophisticated that their own scribes began copying Nilotic mortuary texts for adaptation in Mesopotamian contexts. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, despite his reputation for destroying conquered cultures, ordered the reconstruction of sacred complexes and the restoration of cult observances that would ensure proper treatment for local souls who had died during the conquest. This pragmatic accommodation reflected growing recognition throughout the ancient world that Nile Valley expertise in managing death and rebirth possessed universal value. Persian rule under the Achaemenid dynasty brought even more dramatic changes, as Zoroastrian concepts of universal dualism encountered Nilotic ideas about judgment and ethical accountability. When Cambyses conquered the valley in 525 BC, Persian administrators discovered that local legal codes already included sophisticated frameworks for evaluating moral behavior that complemented their own emphasis on truth versus falsehood. The Persian concept of individual souls facing judgment after death harmonized remarkably with Nile Valley customs, creating theological syntheses that influenced development throughout the Persian Empire. Darius I's policies toward local ceremonial customs revealed the complex negotiations required when imperial administration encountered indigenous concepts about death that commanded popular loyalty. Rather than suppress Nilotic observances, Persian governors incorporated them into imperial frameworks while adapting Persian concepts for valley audiences. The result was a theological fusion that preserved essential elements while introducing Persian innovations in universal geography and judgment procedures. Zoroastrian fire symbolism began appearing in valley tombs, while Persian concepts of rebirth influenced local artistic expressions. The Demotic script that emerged during this period enabled new forms of literature that reflected these cross-cultural influences while remaining accessible to broader populations. Unlike the hieroglyphic texts that had been restricted to educated scribes, Demotic writing allowed ordinary people to read and copy instructions that had previously required professional interpretation. This democratization of literacy created markets for new types of mortuary literature that adapted traditional formulas for contemporary audiences, while incorporating outside influences that enriched valley customs. The books of breathing that became popular during the Hellenistic period represented the culmination of this literary evolution. These abbreviated guides to posthumous existence condensed the essential elements of traditional valley instruction, while incorporating Greek philosophical concepts about the nature of souls and their universal destinations. Unlike the comprehensive Book of the Dead Scrolls that had characterized the New Kingdom, these streamlined texts focused on practical procedures that would ensure basic existence beyond death, without requiring extensive theological education or expensive equipment. Macedonian rulers who inherited Alexander's territories faced the challenge of governing populations whose concepts about death differed fundamentally from Greek customs, while demonstrating their own commitment to ensuring universal order. The solution involved systematic integration of valley and Greek concepts that created new theological frameworks capable of serving diverse populations. Osiris merged with Dionysus to become Serapis, a deity whose rebirth symbolism appealed to both local and Greek audiences, while providing imperial legitimacy for Macedonian rulers. The Hellenistic period witnessed an extraordinary flowering of animal cult observances that reflected both traditional valley reverence for sacred creatures and Greek philosophical interest in the relationship between human and animal consciousness. Sacred complexes throughout the kingdom became vast cemeteries, where millions of ibises, cats, crocodiles, and other creatures received processing and interment that paralleled human burial customs. These observances demonstrated growing conviction that posthumous existence extended throughout the natural world, while providing economic opportunities for communities specializing in animal conservation. Workshops at Tuna El Gabel developed industrial-scale operations for processing the millions of sacred ibises, whose conservation created employment for thousands of workers while generating enormous revenues for sacred institutions. The methods developed for mass processing of small animals required innovations in chemical treatment, packaging systems, and storage facilities that influenced broader burial industries. These developments demonstrated how spiritual convictions could drive technological advancement, while creating economic opportunities that supported entire communities. Individual piety that characterized late-period spiritual life created new emphases on personal relationships with powers who could provide assistance during posthumous journeys. Oracle consultations became increasingly popular as people sought guidance about their readiness for death, while requesting intercession for deceased family members who might be experiencing difficulties in celestial realms. These customs reflected growing anxiety about posthumous welfare that traditional formulas and procedures seemed inadequate to address. The rise of personal gods who specialized in protecting specific individuals during their afterlife transitions represented a significant departure from earlier religious traditions that had emphasized cosmic deities governing universal processes. Household shrines contained images of protective spirits who would accompany their human charges through death and beyond, while personal amulets invoked specific divine assistance for navigating underworld challenges. These developments reflected growing individualization of religious experience that paralleled broader social changes throughout the Hellenistic world. Coffin portrait panels that appeared during the Roman period revealed the complex cultural negotiations that occurred when Greco-Roman artistic traditions encountered Egyptian mortuary practices. These realistic paintings, executed in encaustic techniques that preserved individual features with unprecedented accuracy, replaced traditional Egyptian mummy masks while serving similar functions for posthumous identification. The portraits depicted deceased individuals wearing contemporary clothing and hairstyles that emphasized their participation in cosmopolitan Mediterranean culture, while their placement on mummies demonstrated continued commitment to Egyptian preservation techniques. The artistic synthesis represented by these portraits extended beyond mere aesthetic fusion to include theological innovation that adapted traditional Egyptian concepts for audiences familiar with Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. Portrait subjects were depicted with divine attributes that suggested their posthumous transformation into celestial beings, while symbolic elements referenced both Egyptian and classical traditions for achieving immortality. These images created visual languages that could communicate across cultural boundaries, while maintaining the magical effectiveness that made them functional elements of mortuary preparation. Roman period mummy labels written in Greek and Demotic scripts provided practical information about deceased individuals while invoking divine protection from both Egyptian and classical traditions. These tags identified the deceased by name, family relationships, and place of origin, while requesting assistance from Osiris, Anubis, and other traditional Egyptian deities, alongside Greek and Roman protective spirits. The multilingual character of these texts reflected the cosmopolitan populations that characterized major Egyptian cities during the Roman period, while demonstrating the continuing vitality of Egyptian afterlife traditions. Magical papyri from this period revealed sophisticated integration of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and other Mediterranean religious traditions that created syncretic approaches to managing death and posthumous survival. These texts combined traditional Egyptian mortuary formulas with Greek philosophical concepts, Jewish mystical traditions, and Roman legal frameworks to create comprehensive systems for ensuring favorable posthumous outcomes. The international character of these traditions demonstrated how Egyptian afterlife expertise had influenced religious development throughout the Mediterranean world. The persistence of traditional Egyptian burial practices under foreign rule reflected the deep cultural significance of afterlife beliefs that transcended political arrangements and ethnic identities. Roman citizens living in Egypt adopted Egyptian mummification techniques while maintaining their own cultural identities, creating hybrid mortuary traditions that preserved essential elements from both cultures. These syntheses demonstrated the adaptability of Egyptian afterlife concepts, while revealing their continued relevance for diverse populations seeking security beyond death. Economic pressures created by foreign taxation and administrative policies forced significant modifications in traditional mortuary practices that made adequate afterlife preparation accessible to populations with reduced financial resources. Simplified mummification procedures used local materials instead of expensive imported substances, while abbreviated burial equipment focused on essential protective elements rather than comprehensive posthumous provisions. These adaptations preserved the theological principles that made afterlife preparation effective, while accommodating economic constraints that limited access to traditional services. Professional associations among mortuary workers developed standardized procedures that maintained quality while reducing costs through efficient production methods. Guild systems regulated training, pricing, and territorial arrangements that prevented destructive competition while ensuring adequate services for all social levels. These organizational innovations enabled the mortuary industry to adapt to changing economic conditions while preserving the technical expertise necessary for effective posthumous preparation. Religious festivals that had traditionally celebrated Egyptian deities and their mythological cycles were gradually modified to incorporate foreign elements while maintaining their essential character as community celebrations of death and resurrection. The Osiris festivals at Abydos continued attracting pilgrims from throughout the Mediterranean world, but their observances now included participants from diverse cultural backgrounds who brought their own traditions for honoring the dead. These multicultural celebrations created shared religious experiences that transcended ethnic boundaries while preserving Egyptian theological frameworks. The emergence of mystery religions that offered initiation into secret knowledge about posthumous survival reflected growing anxiety about traditional approaches to managing death that seemed inadequate for addressing contemporary challenges. Isis cults that spread throughout the Roman Empire promised initiates special protection during their afterlife journeys, while providing community support for managing grief and preparing for their own eventual deaths. These religious movements demonstrated the international appeal of Egyptian afterlife concepts, while adapting them for diverse audiences throughout the Mediterranean world. Coptic Christianity that emerged during the later Roman period created the most dramatic synthesis of Egyptian and foreign religious traditions by incorporating traditional mortuary practices into Christian theological frameworks. Early Christian communities in Egypt continued mummifying their dead while reinterpreting traditional afterlife symbolism according to Christian eschatological concepts. Osiris became a prefiguration of Christ's resurrection, while traditional Egyptian judgment scenes were understood as anticipations of Christian final judgment. Coptic funerary art that decorated Christian tombs throughout Egypt revealed sophisticated integration of traditional Egyptian and Christian symbolic systems that created new visual languages for expressing beliefs about death and resurrection. Traditional Egyptian protective deities were reinterpreted as Christian angels, while scenes of posthumous judgment incorporated both Egyptian and Christian elements that appealed to communities familiar with both traditions. These artistic syntheses demonstrated the continuing vitality of Egyptian afterlife concepts, while showing their capacity for adaptation to new theological frameworks. Monastic communities that flourished in the Egyptian desert during the early Christian period developed ascetic practices that drew heavily on traditional Egyptian techniques for preparing souls for separation from earthly existence. Desert fathers who sought to die to the world while still living employed meditation techniques and dietary practices that resembled traditional Egyptian preparations for posthumous transformation. These monastic traditions created bridges between ancient Egyptian and Christian approaches to managing the transition from earthly to spiritual existence. The gradual decline of traditional Egyptian religious practices under Christian and later Islamic rule reflected broader cultural changes that made ancient afterlife concepts less relevant for populations whose worldviews had been transformed by new religious traditions. Temple closures ordered by Christian emperors eliminated the institutional foundations that had supported traditional mortuary practices, while Islamic conquests introduced legal and social frameworks that discouraged pre-Islamic religious observances. Yet elements of traditional Egyptian afterlife beliefs persisted in folk practices that continued influencing popular culture throughout the medieval period and beyond. Coptic magical texts preserved modified versions of ancient protective formulas, while Islamic writers described Egyptian tombs and mummification techniques that continued fascinating scholars and travelers. The reputation of ancient Egyptian wisdom in managing death and achieving immortality influenced esoteric traditions throughout the medieval Mediterranean world, while inspiring literary and artistic works that preserved aspects of ancient beliefs for future generations. Archaeological excavations that began during the 19th century revealed the extraordinary continuity of Egyptian mortuary traditions throughout periods of foreign rule and cultural change. Tombs from the late period and Roman era demonstrated that essential elements of traditional afterlife preparation had been maintained for over a millennium, despite dramatic political and cultural transformations. These discoveries provided evidence for the remarkable adaptability of Egyptian religious concepts, while revealing their profound influence on successor cultures throughout the Mediterranean world. Modern scholarly investigation of late-period mortuary practices has revealed the sophisticated theological and cultural negotiations that enabled ancient Egyptian afterlife concepts to survive and evolve throughout centuries of foreign rule. These studies demonstrate that religious traditions possess remarkable capacity for adaptation when their essential elements address fundamental human concerns that transcend specific cultural contexts. The Egyptian achievement in developing comprehensive approaches to managing death and posthumous survival provided frameworks that influenced religious development throughout the ancient world, while establishing concepts that continue influencing contemporary approaches to understanding mortality and meaning. By the end of the ancient period, Egyptian afterlife beliefs had been transformed through centuries of cross-cultural encounter, while maintaining their essential character as humanity's most sophisticated approach to understanding death and resurrection. The theological syntheses that emerged from contact with foreign traditions had enriched Egyptian concepts while demonstrating their universal relevance for addressing fundamental questions about human destiny and cosmic order. Though political independence had been lost, the intellectual and spiritual achievements represented by Egyptian afterlife traditions had become permanent contributions to human civilization that would continue influencing religious and philosophical development for millennia to come. Brother Samuel bent over his parchment in the monastery scriptorium at St. Catherine's around 550 AD, copying a damaged papyrus that described the weighing of hearts against feathers of truth. Though he served Christ rather than Osiris, The Coptic monk recognized profound wisdom in these pages. The judgment scenes he illustrated showed Anubis and Thoth conducting evaluations that seemed remarkably similar to Christian teachings about final judgment. As Islamic armies swept across the former territories a century later, scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom would make similar discoveries, finding that Sufi mystical journeys through stages of purification paralleled the soul's passage through the duat described in tomb inscriptions. These early preservations proved crucial when European knowledge of the Nile Valley's achievements depended entirely on fragmentary classical sources. Medieval physicians studying Herodotus's descriptions of mummification sought to understand anatomy and decay, while Plutarch's account of Isis and Osiris influenced allegorical interpretations of death and resurrection throughout Christian literature. The Renaissance brought renewed interest through Hermetic texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, though these Hellenistic compositions had little connection to genuine temple wisdom. Everything changed when Napoleon's savants disembarked at Alexandria in 1798. For the first time since the temples closed, European scholars could examine monuments and hieroglyphic inscriptions directly rather than through classical intermediaries. Dominique Vivant Denon stood before the magnificent tombs at Thebes, sketching wall paintings that revealed systematic approaches to death and judgment, far more sophisticated than anything preserved in Greek or Roman sources. His drawings of the weighing ceremony, the journey through underworld regions, and the various soul components would introduce European audiences to humanity's most elaborate vision of life beyond death. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during this expedition provided the key that would unlock these mysteries entirely. When Jean-François Champollion achieved his breakthrough in decipherment during the 1820s, he opened archives containing 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom about mortality and spiritual survival. The first complete translation of a Book of the Dead chapter left European scholars stunned. Here was systematic theology that addressed every aspect of posthumous existence, detailed maps of otherworld geography, comprehensive lists of protective spells, elaborate moral examinations that determined eternal destiny. Champollion himself wrote to his brother after translating chapter 125. This is a judgment scene of extraordinary sophistication. The deceased must deny 42 specific sins before divine assessors, while his heart is weighed against cosmic truth itself. If found wanting, a monster devours his soul entirely. If pure, he enters paradise, where he will farm eternal fields using magical servants. The psychological and ethical framework exceeds anything in classical literature. Public fascination with these discoveries reached fever pitch during the Victorian era. When Giovanni Belzoni's exhibitions displayed actual mummies in London, crowds lined up for hours to witness bodies that had been preserved for millennia through chemical processes that modern science could barely comprehend. The unwrapping ceremonies became theatrical events where audiences confronted their own mortality while marveling at a civilization that had seemingly conquered death through knowledge and preparation. The discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in 1922 provided the most spectacular demonstration of how thoroughly this civilization had prepared for eternity. Howard Carter's methodical documentation revealed not just individual treasures, but complete systems designed to ensure successful passage through death. The Golden Shrine contained detailed instructions for navigating underworld challenges, while nested coffins incorporated protective symbolism that would transform the Boy King into a cosmic deity. Most remarkably, Carter found 4 separate canopic shrines, each containing organs preserved with chemical precision that enabled their reintegration into perfected spiritual bodies. Carter wrote in his excavation diary, Every object placement follows theological principles we are only beginning to understand. The positioning of amulets corresponds to star maps, while the arrangement of grave goods recreates the geography of paradise described in the papyri. This isn't burial. It's a resurrection machine built from gold, stone, and accumulated knowledge spanning centuries. Archaeological investigation throughout the 20th century revealed the systematic character of these achievements. At Deir el-Medina, excavators found the personal correspondence of workers who built royal tombs while planning their own modest versions of eternal preparation. Papyrus documents showed families pooling resources across generations to afford mummification and basic protective equipment, while strike records revealed that workers would abandon royal projects when their own wages, needed for posthumous preparation, were delayed. These discoveries demonstrated that belief in survival after death had shaped every aspect of society, from royal policy to village economics. Chemical analysis of mummy wrappings revealed preservation techniques that achieved results comparable to modern scientific methods, while computer tomography of mummies exposed anatomical knowledge that exceeded what historical sources had suggested. The sophistication extended beyond individual preservation to include systematic approaches to moral evaluation, spiritual geography, and cosmic order that influenced religious thinking throughout the Mediterranean world. The influence proved remarkably durable. Early Christian communities in the Nile Valley continued mummifying their dead while reinterpreting traditional judgment symbolism according to Christian eschatology. Coptic funerary art depicted Christ presiding over weighing ceremonies that preserved essential elements of older traditions while adapting them for new theological frameworks. Islamic mystical literature described soul journeys through purification stages that paralleled the deceased's passage through the Duat regions mapped in tomb paintings. Modern psychological research has identified patterns in near-death experiences that show striking similarities to posthumous journeys described in ancient sources. Reports of life reviews that evaluate moral conduct, encounters with beings of light who serve as guides, and passages through tunnel-like spaces toward realms of extraordinary beauty parallel traditional accounts of what souls experience during their separation from earthly existence. While these similarities cannot validate specific claims about posthumous survival, they suggest that certain aspects of consciousness and perception might transcend ordinary biological processes. Contemporary museum exhibitions featuring mummy displays continue attracting enormous crowds, suggesting that fundamental questions about mortality and meaning remain as compelling today as they were for ancient audiences. Interactive exhibits allow visitors to experience simulated judgment procedures, while digital presentations explain the theological principles underlying various preservation techniques. The enduring appeal reflects continuing human desire for assurance that death need not mean the complete end of personal existence. Neo-pagan movements have embraced these rediscovered traditions as alternatives to conventional religious frameworks. Practitioners of Kemetic Reconstructionism study hieroglyphic texts to understand original concepts about soul structure and posthumous transformation, while contemporary magical traditions incorporate protective formulas originally developed for navigating challenges in the realm of the dead. These revival movements demonstrate the continuing vitality of insights developed through millennia of systematic speculation about consciousness and cosmic order. The most profound legacy may be conceptual rather than practical. The conviction that individual moral choices have cosmic significance, that consciousness might transcend biological death, and that spiritual development represents the fundamental purpose of human existence, continues influencing thought throughout the contemporary world. Though the specific gods and particular practices have largely disappeared from active worship, the essential framework for understanding human destiny that emerged from Nile Valley speculation remains embedded in religious and philosophical traditions worldwide. From natural preservation in desert graves to chemical mummification in royal workshops, from simple ancestor veneration to systematic cosmic theology, from local burial customs to universal frameworks for moral evaluation, the long development of these ideas represented humanity's most sustained attempt to understand what lies beyond visible existence. The accumulated wisdom continues influencing contemporary approaches to mortality, while inspiring hope that death might mark a transformation rather than termination of conscious experience.